"Don't come back inside!" she screamed, slamming the door in my face so hard the porch lights flickered. I stumbled, gripping my walker, my legs still weak from the stroke. A tray of untouched food flew past me, crashed into the dirt. Cold beans, again. My blanket was missing. The barn smelled like manure and mold. Why would my own daughter do this to me? What had I done so wrong? Was I really safer out here than in her house? Or was this her plan all along? If you want to know what happens next, stay with me until the end of the video. And if you still believe deep in your heart that God is always watching over you, silently arranging everything, then right now, leave a comment saying Amen below this video. Because who knows, at the very moment you write those words, a blessing may quietly enter your life. I still remember the way the apple trees looked that spring. I'd just been discharged from the hospital after my minor stroke, and Samantha insisted I move in with her family in Hendersonville. She said it was for the best. "Mom, you shouldn't be living alone anymore." I wanted to believe it came from a place of love, so I packed my life into 2 suitcases and let my daughter drive me 3 hours away from my little rental in Asheville to her big house at the edge of town. At first, I was grateful, truly. I had a warm bed, home-cooked meals, and my granddaughter Emily's laughter floating down the hallway like birdsong. She was my sunshine, that girl. She reminded me of Samantha when she was little before ambition got in the way of everything else. The stroke had left me slower than I liked. My left leg dragged a bit, and my hand sometimes dropped things without warning. I couldn't cook like I used to. That was the hardest part, being in a kitchen and not being me anymore. I had spent 30 years behind a diner stove, flipping pancakes and greeting folks by name. Cooking was how I expressed love. Now, I felt useless. And that feeling crept into everything. Samantha had a schedule. Medication at 8, meals at noon and 6. She was organized, clinical, but she was busy too. Conference calls, social events, PTA meetings. Nathan, her husband, was polite but distant. I saw him more in passing than in conversation. And Emily, sweet girl, was always being shuffled from one activity to the next. Our moments together became stolen whispers at bedtime, secret smiles over morning cereal. By April, things had shifted. Samantha started making comments, little things at first. "Mom, I can't keep cooking separately for your dietary needs." Or, "It's really hard with you taking up the downstairs guest room. We need that for Nathan's office." I tried to be understanding. I offered to eat less, move upstairs, even though the stairs frightened me. I wanted to be less of a burden. That's what she made me feel, like an obligation, a cost. One afternoon, she brought up something unexpected. "Mom, we still own the stable out back. It's cleaned out now. We used to keep the lawn tools there. Maybe we could fix it up, just until we sort things out." I stared at her, not understanding. "You want me to live? In the stable?" She laughed, too quickly. "Not live. Just rest there during the day. Fresh air, right? It's just. The girls have ballet lessons in the living room now, and we need the space." I said nothing. That evening my bed was moved. A twin mattress on the wooden floor, 2 old blankets, and a standing lamp with a frayed cord. No insulation, no windows, just wooden slats and a sliding door that creaked like it was in pain. It wasn't the worst place I'd ever slept, but it was the worst I'd ever felt. I told myself it was temporary. I prayed quietly, constantly. I asked the Lord for patience, for humility, for strength. The nights got cold in early spring. Samantha forgot to bring out my dinner twice that week. On the 3rd night, Emily appeared at the door, clutching a peanut butter sandwich and crying. "I saved it from lunch, Grandma. Mommy said you weren't hungry, but I know you are." I cried after she left, quietly, so no one would hear. I didn't want Emily to worry. That girl had too much weight on her shoulders already. Weeks passed. I learned how to live with less. Less food, less comfort, less dignity. I waited for Samantha to remember who I was. Not a patient, not a problem, but her mother. The woman who'd stayed up all night sewing her Halloween costumes, who'd worked double shifts to buy her school supplies, who'd cried when she left for college and wrote her every week without fail. But that version of me didn't seem to exist anymore. Then came the cough. Dry at first, then heavy. The nights grew colder, and I couldn't keep warm under the thin blanket. I tried not to let Emily see how bad I looked, but I knew it was getting worse. I started talking to God more, not asking for rescue, just a little grace, a little peace. I didn't know then that someone else was watching, that someone had heard the coughing, seen the light on in the barn, late at night. But that came later. For now, I just curled up on that thin mattress, listening to the wind rattle the boards. And I told myself a story, one where a mother's love was enough to bring a daughter back from whatever darkness she'd chosen. And then I fell asleep with that story in my heart. I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside the stable. At first, I thought it was a raccoon or maybe the neighbor's dog again. But then I heard the whisper. "Grandma?" It was Emily. I sat up slowly, wincing as pain shot down my back. The mattress was damp from the morning dew. My blanket had slipped off in the night. "Emily, sweetheart," I whispered. "What are you doing out here so early?" She squeezed through the cracked door with a flashlight in one hand and a thermos in the other. "I brought you tea," she said proudly. "I put in extra honey the way you like it." I took the thermos with trembling hands. It was warm, and just holding it made my fingers stop aching. "You're an angel," I said, voice hoarse. "Your mama knows you're out here?" She shook her head. "She's still asleep." I snuck out the back. I should have scolded her, told her it wasn't safe, that she shouldn't be creeping around in the dark. But I couldn't. Not when she looked at me like that, like I mattered. She sat down beside me on the mattress. "Why are you still out here, Grandma? It's been almost 2 months." I sighed. "Your mama's just overwhelmed. A lot's going on. Sometimes people don't act right when they're stressed. But she said you wanted to be out here." My heart sank. "She told me you said the house was too noisy and you liked the quiet." I reached for her hand. "Sometimes grown-ups say things they don't mean, baby, or things they want to believe." She looked at me with those big, knowing eyes. Then she pulled something from her pocket, a tiny digital recorder, the kind they sell for school projects. "I recorded her last night," Emily whispered. "She was talking on the phone with someone. I didn't understand all of it, but she said, as long as she stays out there, she won't be around to tell her doctor anything." My mouth went dry. Emily. End of 10. I wanted to show it to Dad, but he just told me to go to bed. I didn't know what to say. Part of me didn't want to know what else was on that tape. Another part, the stronger part, knew I had to. "Leave it with me," I said softly. "Just for now. And don't tell your mama you came out here this morning." She nodded solemnly and slipped the recorder under my pillow. As she left, I watched her tiptoe through the dew-covered grass, back toward the house that used to feel like home. I sat in silence for a while, the thermos still warm in my lap, heart pounding louder than the wind in the trees. That afternoon, Samantha came by. She brought me a plate of cold toast and a single boiled egg. "You should eat something," she said flatly. "You look pale." I didn't say anything, just smiled politely, like I always did. She looked around the stable with a wrinkled nose. "We really need to get someone to clean this place properly. It's not sanitary." End. My fingers tightened around the thermos. It wasn't meant to be lived in. Her eyes narrowed for a split second, but then she forced a smile. "You chose this, remember? You said you liked the privacy." I didn't respond. As she turned to leave, I said, "Samantha, do you remember the night your father died?" She stopped mid-step. "What? You were 10. You crawled into bed with me and said you were scared. I held you all night." She didn't answer. "I never made you feel like you were in the way." Silence. Then she turned around. "Well, things change, Mom. People change, and we all have to adjust." She closed the door behind her, and I listened to her footsteps fade away. That night, I played the recording. Emily's little voice opened it. Testing. 1, 2, 3. And then there was static, followed by Samantha's voice. She's still here, yeah. I can't exactly dump her somewhere. Not yet. Not while the bank's still processing the claim. A pause. No, I don't think she understands what's happening. She's too slow now, but if I move her to a facility, they'll start asking questions. Another pause. Laughter. No, she just sits in the stable. She thinks it's temporary. Hell, maybe she wants it that way. I stopped the tape. For the first time in my life, I felt something shift inside me. Not sadness, not fear, something older, stronger. Resolve. The next morning, Hazel Granger showed up. She hadn't knocked on my door or stall, rather in years. We'd had a falling out a decade ago over something trivial. I don't even remember what. But there she was, standing at the edge of the stable in her long brown coat and sensible shoes. "Lorraine?" she called. "Is that you?" I opened the door slowly. She gasped. "Oh my God." She took in the mattress, the mildew on the walls, the cold metal food tray. "I thought you were traveling," she said, voice shaking. "That's what Samantha told everyone. Said you were on some extended retreat in the mountains." I laughed. Not because it was funny, just because I couldn't believe how far the lies had spread. "I need your help, Hazel," I said. "But not for me. For Emily." She took a deep breath. "Tell me everything." And so I did. I told her about the stroke, the move, the barn. I told her about the recording. I told her I didn't want revenge. I didn't even want to press charges. I just wanted out. I wanted peace. Hazel wiped her eyes. "You're coming home with me tonight." "I can't," I whispered. "Not yet. I need to protect that child." She looked me dead in the eyes. "Then we'll do it the right way. But you won't spend another night in this hellhole." That night, for the first time in months, I slept in a real bed. Hazel's guest room smelled like lavender and old books. I hadn't slept that well in years. The sheets were soft, the room was warm, and when I woke up, there was a tray of oatmeal and hot coffee waiting on the side table made just the way I liked it. Hazel wasn't much for small talk. She bustled around the kitchen like a woman on a mission, occasionally muttering things like, "That girl's lost her damn mind," or, "I always knew Nathan didn't have a spine." I sat quietly, sipping my coffee, feeling more human with each passing hour. But my heart was still back in that stable with Emily. Hazel finally sat down across from me. "You sure you don't want to press charges?" "I don't," I said, stirring the oatmeal. "But I do want the truth to come out. Quietly, if possible. For Emily's sake." Hazel narrowed her eyes. "There's no quietly when it comes to child neglect and elder abuse, Lorraine. This town may be small, but word travels fast." I gave her a tired smile. "Then let it travel, but let's do it right." End of quote. And so began the plan. Hazel had friends in places I didn't even know existed. Retired nurses, social workers, a cousin on the town council. Within a week, she'd compiled a folder thicker than a Bible. Pictures of the stable, printed transcripts of the audio file, notes from neighbors who had noticed my sudden disappearance from Samantha's porch, and Sunday church service. "I'll take this to Adult Protective Services," Hazel said, flipping through the folder. "And I've already arranged for a doctor to assess you tomorrow. Independent, trustworthy." I nodded. "Thank you, Hazel. I don't deserve your help, not after all these years." She looked up sharply. "You deserve more than help, Lorraine. You deserve dignity, and you're going to get it back." Later that afternoon, I asked Hazel if I could go see Emily. Not at the house, too risky, but maybe after school, at the park near the old library where I used to take her on Thursdays. Hazel agreed, but insisted on coming with me. We waited on a bench, the late summer sun casting golden light through the trees. Emily arrived with her school backpack bouncing against her back, her face lighting up when she saw me. "Grandma!" she cried, running into my arms. I held her tight, breathing in her scent, shampoo and crayons and childhood. "Are you okay?" she asked. "Mom said you were visiting a friend." I glanced at Hazel, who gave me a slight nod. "I am visiting a friend," I said. But I needed a break, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups need time to think, too. She studied my face. You're not going back to the stable, are you? No, I said gently. I'm not. She looked relieved. Then, serious. Are you going to tell on Mommy? My throat tightened. What do you think I should do? Emily sat quietly for a long moment. I think she's not bad all the way, but she doesn't see you right anymore. Like you disappeared. That hit harder than I expected. Then maybe, I said softly, she needs to see the truth. Emily nodded and reached into her backpack. I made you something. She handed me a folded piece of paper. Inside was a drawing of me and her sitting under a big tree, reading a book. Above our heads were little hearts, and at the bottom it said, My Forever Grandma. I swallowed hard. It's beautiful. Promise you'll keep it? Forever. The next day, the doctor came. A tall woman with calm eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She asked questions, took notes, examined my bruises and recorded my blood pressure. She didn't speak much, but at the end, she placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. You're strong, she said, and you've been through more than most. I'm tired, I admitted. Then let someone else carry the burden now. Just for a little while. Oh. Hazel sent the doctor's report off that evening, along with the rest of the documentation, and then we waited. 3 days later, a social worker named Margaret stopped by. She wore a crisp blouse and practical shoes, and she listened more than she spoke. She thanked me for my courage, said they were opening an official case, and asked for permission to speak with Emily privately at school. I agreed. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about how Samantha would react, about Emily, about the fallout. But part of me deep down felt lighter. The fallout came fast. It started with whispers in the grocery store. A woman from Samantha's book club called Hazel, crying. I didn't know Hazel. I thought Lorraine was traveling. Then came the phone call. It was Nathan. Mrs. Delaney, he said, voice quiet. I just heard what's happening. I had no idea it was that bad. You knew enough, I said. You chose silence. He didn't argue. I've moved out, he said. With Emily, I'm filing for legal custody. She's not safe with Samantha anymore. I sat down slowly. Where are you staying? With my sister in Waynesville. Just for now. I want to see Emily, I said. You will. Soon. I promise. A week later, Samantha's face was on the front page of the Hendersonville local paper. Well-known PTA leader under investigation for elder neglect. The article didn't name me, but it didn't have to. Everyone knew. Samantha called twice. I didn't answer. She didn't leave a message. And just like that, the house on the hill became quiet. Hazel and I watched it all unfold from her kitchen window. She handed me a glass of sweet tea and said, That's justice, Lorraine. I nodded. But it still hurts. It always will, she replied. But hurt isn't the end. Sometimes it's the beginning. And she was right. That night, I pulled out Emily's drawing and pinned it to the wall beside my bed. I stared at it until I fell asleep, not dreaming of barns or cold floors, but of trees and books and a little girl who still believed in forever. The first time I stood outside the little white church on Maple Street, I felt like I was coming home to a place I'd never been. It was a modest building, nothing grand peeling paint on the shutters, a slightly tilted cross above the entryway, but it radiated peace. And that morning, peace was all I wanted. Hazel brought me. She said they served hot meals to seniors on Fridays and that Reverend Thomas Keene had a heart bigger than his sermons. I wasn't sure what that meant, but I came anyway, mostly because I needed something somewhere that didn't smell like disinfectant or pity. Inside, the church was warm and quiet. A few older folks sat around folding tables, sipping soup and chatting in hushed tones. I felt out of place at first, like I was wearing someone else's skin. Then he appeared, Reverend Keene. He looked nothing like I expected. Maybe mid-50s, tall but not imposing, with a weathered face and gentle eyes. He walked with a slight limp, and there was a quiet strength about him, like someone who had lived through storms and come out softer, not harder. "Miss Delaney," he said, offering a hand. "I'm Thomas. Hazel told me a bit about you." I shook his hand, unsure of what to say. "Only the good parts, I hope." He smiled. "Only the honest ones." We sat for a while. He didn't press me for details, didn't quote scripture or offer unsolicited comfort. He just listened, really listened when I finally started to talk. About the stable, about Samantha, about Emily. "I don't want to be bitter," I said at one point, "but I'm so tired of trying to justify what she did. I keep asking myself what I did wrong." "You loved her," he said. "That's not a mistake." That was the first time I cried in front of a stranger. I started coming back to the church every Friday, then Wednesdays, then Sundays. Not because I was looking for salvation, but because I found sanctuary. They gave me a room in the back wing, a converted storage space with a small bed, a lamp, and a window that looked out onto the apple trees behind the building. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. And more importantly, it wasn't a secret. I was seen there, heard, valued. Within a few weeks, I began volunteering in the kitchen. My hands still shook sometimes, but I could stir soup, wash vegetables, teach the younger volunteers how to make real biscuits, not the frozen kind they sold at supermarkets. People started asking me for recipes, then stories. And before long, I was known not as the woman who lived in the barn, but as Miss Lorraine, the lady with the kind voice and the famous chicken pot pie. And that mattered. More than I could say. Emily wrote me letters. Every week. She'd draw little doodles in the margins, sunflowers, cats, stars. Her words were full of updates about school, friends, and her new home with Nathan's sister. She missed me, of course, but she was adjusting. She said they had game nights, and she was learning how to knit. She ended every letter the same way. "You are my always. Love, Emily." Sometimes I'd cry when I read them, but not out of sadness, out of gratitude, because I still had her. And that was more than enough. One morning, I woke to find a small envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a folded note and a check. "Lorraine, this is not forgiveness. I'm not ready for that yet, but I owe you at least this much. Samantha." I stared at the paper for a long time. The check was for $5,000. I never cashed it. Instead, I placed it in the offering box at the church with a note that said, "For the pantry, feed the ones who are still forgotten." Hazel called it poetic justice. I just called it moving on. Later that fall, I helped organize the church's Thanksgiving dinner. We cooked for nearly 100 people, volunteers, seniors, families from the shelters. I made 6 pies from scratch and taught 3 teenagers how to baste a turkey properly. Reverend Keene stood beside me that night, watching the room buzz with laughter and clinking plates. "You built this," he said softly. I shook my head. "Number, this place built me." He smiled. Maybe it was a little of both. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about the stable. The cold, the silence, the way I used to pray for just one warm hand to hold. And then I think about Emily's letters, Hazel's coffee, the choir practicing off-key in the next room. About how healing doesn't always come like a flash of light, but in small moments. A spoon of soup, a shared smile, a story told without shame. I'm not who I was before the stroke, but maybe I'm more. It started with banana bread. I made a few loaves one Saturday morning because the kitchen was too quiet and my hands needed something to do. I used an old recipe I'd tucked into my Bible years ago, the paper soft with time and fingerprints. I brought the bread to the church pantry without thinking much of it. By the next morning, there was a note taped to the kitchen door. "Whoever made that banana bread, bless you." It reminded me of my mama. Jay. I didn't know who Jay was, but something in that note stuck with me. So the next Saturday, I made cinnamon rolls, then chicken and dumplings, then shepherd's pie. I started leaving little handwritten recipe cards beside the dishes, with notes like, "Perfect for cold nights," or best shared with someone you love. And slowly, people began to talk. Not about me exactly, but about the food, the warmth, the memories it brought up. I'd sit quietly in the back pew on Sundays and listen as folks swapped stories about mothers who used to make biscuits from scratch, about grandfathers who stirred soup while humming old hymns. Food, I realized, was my language. And now, it was becoming my ministry. Reverend Keene noticed, of course. He always did. He approached me one afternoon with a gentle smile and said, "You know, we've been looking to start a weekly gathering for the seniors in town, something beyond Sunday service. A meal, some music, conversation." I raised an eyebrow. "And you want me to cook for a crowd?" He chuckled. "I want you to lead it." I stared at him. "Thomas, I'm not a minister." "No," he said. "You're something better. You're living proof of grace." ND. I didn't answer right away. But that night, I sat in my little room and thought about all the places I'd been, physically, emotionally, and how, for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel small or forgotten. So I said yes. We called it Supper and Stories. Every Thursday evening, the back hall filled with the sound of clinking dishes, shuffling feet, and the soft murmur of old folks remembering who they used to be. Some came just for the food. Some stayed for the stories. Some, like me, just needed to feel seen. I didn't preach. That wasn't my calling. But I shared. I told them about my first job at the diner, about my husband Joe, who used to sing off-key while fixing the roof, about the time I almost burned down the kitchen trying to make caramel. And yes, eventually, I told them about the stable, not to shame Samantha, not even to shock anyone, but because silence had kept me in the dark. And I believed, deep down, that telling the truth, even the painful parts, was a way to reclaim light. They listened. They nodded. Some cried. And after, a man named Carl Big Hands, retired factory worker, came up and whispered, "My son stopped calling 6 years ago. I thought maybe it was just me." "It's not just you," I said. And that became the point. Supper and Stories wasn't about food. It was about being reminded we weren't alone. Word spread. You wouldn't think something so simple would matter, but in a town like Hendersonville, where loneliness clings like humidity in summer, it did. A woman from the radio station came to do a little segment. Then the local paper. Then a group of high school students asked if they could volunteer, serve meals, clean up, sit, and talk. That part touched me the most. One boy named Marcus came every Thursday like clockwork. Tall, quiet, always wore a hoodie, no matter the weather. One evening, after the crowd had thinned out, he helped me wipe down tables in silence. Then he said, "You know, my grandma raised me. She died last year. I didn't get to say goodbye." I set down my cloth. "Want to tell me about her?" And he did. For 20 minutes, he told me stories about her homemade cornbread, her laugh, the way she used to fall asleep watching game shows. And I listened, because that's what we all need sometimes, someone to hold our memories with us. When he finished, he looked down and said, "I think she would have liked you." I smiled. I think I would have liked her too. One night, after everyone had gone home and the lights were dim, I sat alone in the kitchen, stirring a pot of stew for the next day. Reverend Keene stepped in, still wearing his choir robe. "Long night?" he asked. I shrugged. "Good one." He leaned against the doorway. "Do you ever think—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "That what happened to you was meant for something bigger?" I thought about that for a moment. Then I nodded. I used to think I'd lost everything. But maybe I just lost the things that were keeping me from finding this. He smiled. "You're a stubborn miracle, Lorraine." "Only on Thursdays," I joked. Sometimes, Samantha's name still came up. A woman from town mentioned she'd seen her at a coffee shop, looking thinner, tired. Rumor was she moved out of state. I didn't ask where. I didn't need to know. What I knew was that I had found a life not built on obligation, but on grace freely given, and that every time I stirred a pot, folded a napkin, or held someone's story in my hands, I was building something real. Something lasting. And maybe, just maybe, something holy. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when I saw her again. I was standing at the sink in the church kitchen, peeling apples for a cobbler, when Hazel came in, wiping her hands on her apron. "You've got a visitor," she said, with a little gleam in her eye. I raised an eyebrow. "Who?" She didn't say, but she's waiting in the hallway like she's afraid to come in. That's when I knew. I set down the paring knife, wiped my hands, and walked slowly to the hall. The sunlight filtered through the old stained glass windows, casting soft colors across the wooden floor. And there she was, Emily. She'd grown taller in just a few months. Her hair was longer, pulled back into a ponytail. She wore a denim jacket covered in little enamel pins, and her backpack hung from one shoulder. But her eyes, those wide, soft eyes, were exactly the same. "Grandma," she whispered. I opened my arms. She dropped her backpack and ran into them like she used to when she was 5, her little arms wrapping around my waist, her head pressed into my chest. "I missed you," she said, her voice muffled. I held her tighter. "I missed you more." We sat on the front steps of the church, sipping lemonade. She kicked her feet slowly, staring out at the trees across the street. "I wanted to come sooner," she said, "but Dad said we needed time. He thought maybe it would make things easier for Mom." I nodded. "He's a good man. Careful." "Yeah," she said quietly, "but I don't think time fixes everything. Sometimes you just need to show up." I looked at her, 13 years old now, and wiser than most grown folks I'd met. "I'm glad you showed up," I said. "You've always had a good heart." She smiled faintly. "I brought something." From her backpack, she pulled out a small notebook. The cover was worn, filled with stickers and doodles. She handed it to me like it was something sacred. "I've been writing in it since you left," she said. "Stuff I wanted to tell you, stuff I didn't know how to say." I flipped it open. On the first page, in her careful handwriting, were the words, "Things I want Grandma to know." My throat tightened. "I wrote about school," she continued, "and our cat, and the time Dad tried to make lasagna and almost burned down the kitchen. But I also wrote about Mom." I paused, looked at her gently. "You don't have to." "I know," she interrupted. "But I want to." She shifted on the step. "She's different now, quieter. She doesn't yell anymore. She doesn't smile much either. She's trying, I think. But I don't think she knows how to fix things. And I don't think she knows how to say sorry." I nodded slowly. "Some people carry guilt like a stone in their pocket. They forget how to open their hand." Emily leaned her head on my shoulder. "Do you hate her?" I thought for a long moment. "No," I said softly, "but I don't trust her, and those are different things." She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "I think she misses you, but she doesn't know how to stop being scared." "Scared of what?" "Of being wrong. Of being seen." I let out a slow breath. "I know that feeling." We sat in silence, the wind rustling the trees, the distant sound of birdsong weaving through the late afternoon. "I wish you lived with us again," she said suddenly. I looked down at her. "I do too. But I'm where I need to be right now." She nodded. "I get that. You're kind of like the church now." "And food." "What do you mean?" "You're still and warm and always open." That broke something soft in me. I pulled her close and kissed the top of her head. "Can I come help on Thursdays?" she asked. "At supper and stories?" I smiled. "Of course you can. We need a biscuit expert. I'll start practicing." From that week on, Emily came every Thursday after school. She'd tie on an apron too big for her and take charge of setting the tables. She loved folding the napkins into funny shapes, roses, fans, sometimes even little birds. She brought light into the room, the kind that comes from joy that's been through darkness. People loved her instantly. She'd sit beside the seniors, ask about their childhoods, compliment their outfits. One woman cried when Emily complimented her earrings, said it was the first kind word she'd received in weeks. I watched her work, this girl with a heart so open, so tender, and I thought, this is my legacy. Not bitterness, not regret, but her. One night, after supper and stories, Emily and I stayed behind to clean. She scrubbed the sink while I wiped the counters. "You know," she said, not looking up, "when I grow up, I want to open a place like this." "A church?" "No," she giggled. "A kitchen, with long tables, for people who feel invisible." I turned toward her. "That's a beautiful dream." She smiled. "It's your dream, too." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just nodded and let the silence fill the room like warm bread rising. We walked home under the stars, her hand in mine, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't look back. I never thought anything I did in that little church kitchen would reach beyond the town of Hendersonville. But life has a funny way of surprising you once you stop waiting for anything at all. It was a Tuesday, like most good things in my life lately. The sun was out, and I was peeling carrots for a vegetable stew, humming an old hymn under my breath, when Hazel burst into the kitchen holding a manila envelope. She was breathless, flushed, and looked like she'd just run up a flight of stairs she hadn't planned to climb. "Lorraine," she said, waving the envelope like it was on fire, "you're not going to believe this." I raised an eyebrow. "You found my missing pie tin?" She ignored me. "Someone submitted a story about you to the Southern Table." I blinked. "The magazine?" She nodded, grinning. "The food and culture one. Real fancy stuff." I took the envelope, opened it with carrot-covered fingers, and pulled out a copy of the most recent issue. There, in the back pages, under the section called Hearts of the South, was a small feature titled, "From Stable to Sanctuary, One Woman's Kitchen of Grace." My name was there, my picture too blurry, probably from a phone camera, me smiling with a ladle in my hand. The article was simple but beautiful. It talked about supper and stories, the recipes, the laughter, and how food could build bridges between generations. I read it twice. Then I just sat down, stunned. "Who sent this in?" I asked. Hazel grinned. "I'll give you one guess. Emily." She nodded. "She sent it in months ago, along with one of her drawings and a photo of your banana bread. Said she wanted people to know how her grandma changed the world with a crock pot and kindness." "And," I laughed, blinking back tears, "that girl's gonna break hearts one day." "She already has," Hazel said. "In the best way. The story didn't go viral or anything like that. I didn't suddenly have a cookbook deal or a television show. But something shifted. More people started coming on Thursdays. A family from out of town drove 40 minutes just to share a meal and say thank you. A local high school invited me to speak to their senior class about resilience. A nearby senior center asked if I could help them start a similar meal program. I said yes to everything I could. Not because I needed the attention, but because I finally had something worth sharing and the strength to share it. Then, one day in late spring, Reverend Keene invited me to his office. He had that same, calm, unreadable expression he wore during sermons that made people weep without knowing why. "I got a call yesterday," he said, folding his hands on the desk. "Oh?" I sat, careful not to knock over the little ceramic lamb Emily had made him for Easter. "It was from the diocese," he said. "They read the article. Apparently, someone high up, someone who usually doesn't pay attention to small-town church news, was deeply moved." He tilted my head. "Moved how?" "They're starting a community outreach initiative," he continued, "focused on senior care, food insecurity, and intergenerational support. They want to create a pilot program, and they want you to lead it." I stared at him. "Me?" He nodded. "They'll fund it, give you a space, a budget, volunteers. You'd still be based here, of course, but you'd oversee workshops, train other churches, maybe even visit other towns to help them set up their own supper and stories." I laughed a little too loud. "Thomas, I'm 70, 2 years old and walk like a duck on a windy day." He smiled. "And yet, somehow, you've built something that heals people." I shook my head slowly. "I'm not trained. I don't have a degree. I barely know how to use a computer." "You have a calling," he said simply. "That's more than most." I sat back in the chair, hands trembling slightly in my lap. Not from fear, at least not entirely, but from the strange, giddy feeling that maybe, just maybe, there was still more life to live. I thought of Emily, of the little notebook, of the woman last week who said my dumplings tasted like her mother's last Christmas dinner before cancer took her. I thought of the stable, and how far I'd come. "I'll need help," I said finally. Thomas grinned. "You'll have it." That night, I sat on the edge of my bed with Emily's latest letter in my lap. She wrote about a new friend at school, a science fair project involving plant food, and how she was practicing her biscuit recipe every weekend. At the end, she wrote, "Grandma, I told my teacher today that you're my hero, not because of what happened, but because of what you did after. You didn't turn cold. You turned kind. That's harder." I read that line 3 times. And then I got up, pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, and wrote my first note back to her in months. It started with, "You made me brave again." The first time I stood in front of a group of strangers as a guest speaker, I nearly backed out. It was a small senior center in Asheville, just 30 miles from Hendersonville, but the air felt different, more clinical, more tired. The walls were painted beige, the kind that fades under fluorescent light. The chairs were metal, and the coffee lukewarm. They'd pushed a few tables together in a makeshift circle. About 20 people sat scattered across the room, mostly older women, a few men. Some looked curious. Most looked wary. I stood at the front, holding a sheet of paper I didn't need, hands trembling slightly. "My name is Lorraine Delaney," I began, "and I used to live in a stable." That got their attention. I told them the short version enough to paint the picture, but not so much that it turned into a sermon. I talked about the soup kitchen, about Emily, about supper and stories. I told them what I'd learned, that silence doesn't protect us, that kindness isn't weakness, that healing doesn't mean forgetting. When I finished, the room was quiet. Then, a woman near the back, a thin lady with oxygen tubes and bright blue eyes, raised her hand. "What do you do when the people who hurt you are the only family you have left?" The question hit hard. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because I did. "I think," I said slowly, "you stop trying to change them, and you start building a life that doesn't depend on their approval." She nodded, tears glinting in her eyes. Another woman raised her hand, then a man. And soon, it wasn't just a talk, it was a circle of truth-telling. One man admitted he hadn't spoken to his daughter in 12 years. Another said his son only visited when he needed money. A woman in a purple shawl whispered that she'd been living in her nephew's garage for over a year. It was like pulling thread from an old sweater, one story led to another. And soon the room was unraveling, softly, bravely. When the session ended, the director pulled me aside. "I've worked here for 15 years, she said. "I've never seen them open up like that. Ev." I smiled. "Sometimes all it takes is someone who's been in the dark." She squeezed my hand. "We need more of this." The following weeks became a blur of drives and conversations. I visited churches, nursing homes, community centers. Sometimes I spoke to 10 people, sometimes 3. Once, a group of 25 gathered in a Baptist church basement and brought their own cornbread to share. Everywhere I went, I carried a little black binder filled with stories, drawings, and recipes from Hendersonville. I called it the Soul Binder, and when people asked, I'd say, "This isn't mine, it belongs to anyone who needs it." And people needed it. In one center, a man named Walter told me he hadn't had a real conversation in months. "People talk at me," he said. "Not to me." We sat for an hour, drinking instant coffee, talking about jazz and his late wife's apple pie recipe. He gave me a folded napkin before I left, with shaky handwriting. "Thank you for seeing me." Back in Hendersonville, things were changing too. Emily had started a kindness table at school, a place where kids could leave notes of encouragement, share snacks, or just sit with someone who looked lonely. "Everyone needs a little softness," she told me. At the church, supper and stories expanded. We added a second night for memory meals, where guests brought old family recipes and shared stories that came with them. One woman brought her grandmother's pickled okra. A man brought a dented coffee, can filled with handwritten recipes from 1952. We didn't just eat, we remembered. But it wasn't all easy. Sometimes I'd come home from a visit and just sit in the dark, exhausted. Some stories clung to me, like the man whose wife was in a memory care unit and didn't remember his name, or the woman whose son hadn't called in 6 birthdays. I carried their pain in small ways, through prayers, through stew pots, through soft-spoken phone calls late at night when Hazel would say, "You okay, Lorraine?" And I'd answer, "Just full, that's all," because I was. Full of stories, of ache, of gratitude. And through it all, I kept telling myself what Reverend Keene said the night I accepted the diocese offer. Your job isn't to fix the broken, it's to remind them they're not forgotten. One afternoon, after a talk at a center in Brevard, a woman named Teresa approached me. She was tiny, no taller than my shoulder, and wore a hat decorated with silk violets. "I've been thinking about something you said," she said quietly. "What's that?" "That maybe our worst moments aren't the end of our story." I smiled. "I believe that." She pulled something from her purse, a small box, like one that might hold jewelry. Inside was a slip of paper. "I wrote this down after my sister stopped speaking to me," she said. "I didn't know what to do with it, but I want you to have it." The paper read, "I am not defined by who left. I am held by who stayed." I folded it gently, placed it in my soul binder, and I carried it with me ever since. The letter came on a rainy morning in early July. I just finished folding tablecloths after supper and stories when Hazel handed me a plain white envelope, no return address. Just my name, Lorraine Delaney, in neat, unfamiliar handwriting. I opened it slowly, expecting another thank you note, maybe a recipe request. But the first line stopped me cold. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I owe you the truth." It was from Samantha. I hadn't heard from her in nearly a year, not since that unsigned check she left under my door. I never cashed it. I never answered. Some part of me thought I'd never see her again. But here she was, in my hands, in ink. She wrote that she had moved to Georgia, that she was in therapy, that she had started volunteering at a women's shelter, trying to make herself useful instead of just feeling guilty. She wrote about Emily, how proud she was of her, how she knew their relationship was damaged, but she hoped one day to earn back some trust. Then came the hardest part. "You didn't deserve what I did. Not ever." I was angry. Not at you, but at life, at myself, at the pressure I felt to be everything and the fear that I wasn't enough. "I used your vulnerability as a place to hide my failure. I made you smaller so I wouldn't have to face how far I'd fallen." I had to sit down after that. The rain tapped on the window like it was waiting for my answer, too. At the end of the letter, she said she was coming through Hendersonville in 2 weeks, that she didn't expect to see me, but if I was willing even just for 5 minutes, she'd be sitting on the back bench at the Orchard Cafe on Wednesday at noon. "If not, I'll leave quietly, and I'll still be grateful you opened your arms once, even if I never deserved it." I folded the letter, Saturday with it in my lap for a long time. Then I made tea, the strong kind. The 2 weeks passed like molasses, slow and sticky with thought. Hazel didn't push me. She just left space for me to speak. Reverend Keene said only, "Grace is not a door. It's a window. You open it as wide or as narrow as your heart allows." Emily, when I told her, simply took my hand and said, "Whatever you decide, I love you." That helped more than anything. On Wednesday, I wore the same blue sweater I'd had on the last time Samantha and I stood in the same room. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted her to see what hadn't changed. The cafe was quiet, just the soft murmur of conversation and the clink of spoons in coffee cups. I stood outside for a full 5 minutes before I stepped in, and there she was, sitting alone at the far bench, nursing a cup of tea. Her hair was shorter, her shoulders more slumped. There was a tiredness in her eyes I didn't remember seeing before, but maybe it had always been there, and I just hadn't wanted to see it. She looked up. We locked eyes. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just nodded. I sat down across from her. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a small, framed photo me, holding Emily in the church kitchen. "I saw this in the article," she said. "Emily keeps a copy in her journal." I didn't answer. She set the photo down gently, as if placing it on an altar. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know that word is too small, but I needed to say it." I stared at the photo, then at her. "You left me in the dark," I said, voice steady. "You told your daughter lies about me. You used me, and then you disappeared." She nodded, eyes filling. "I know, but I didn't break." A tear slipped down her cheek. "I see that now." I folded my hands in my lap. "You said you're trying." I am," she whispered. "Every day." I watched her a long time. Then I said, "Good. Keep trying. Not for me. For her. For yourself." She nodded again, wiping her eyes. "I didn't come to ask you to let me back in," she said. "Just to thank you for being the kind of mother I couldn't understand until too late." I stood up slowly. "You still have a long road," I said. "Don't stop walking it." Then I walked away, and it didn't feel like running. It felt like peace. That night, Emily curled up next to me on my bed at the church. "You saw her?" she asked softly. I did. "And?" "She's trying," I said, "and that's a start." Emily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you think people can really change?" I looked at her, brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "I think people can remember who they were meant to be. And sometimes, that's even better." She smiled and whispered, "You always know what to say." I smiled back, only because I've lived through what not to. It started with a shoebox full of recipes. Old, yellowed index cards with handwritten notes in faded ink, some barely legible, smudged with flour or time. I'd kept them for decades, moving them from one kitchen drawer to another, never quite ready to throw them away. Emily found the box one rainy Saturday afternoon as we were cleaning out a storage closet behind the church kitchen. "What's this?" she asked, lifting the lid. I looked over her shoulder and smiled. "That," I said, "is my mother's cornbread, and my Aunt Nora's jam cookies, and your great-grandpa Henry's chili recipe, though he never measured anything." She pulled out a card and read it aloud. 2 eggs, 1 cup of buttermilk, and just enough love to hold it together." She laughed. "Is that an actual measurement?" I chuckled. "In our family, it island." She sat cross-legged on the floor, spreading the cards around her like treasure. "Grandma," she said suddenly, "we should do something with these." "Like what?" "I don't know. A book, maybe? With stories? Not just recipes, but the people behind them?" I paused. It wasn't the first time someone had suggested I write a book. Reverend Keene had mentioned it once. Hazel, too. But I always brushed it off, said I wasn't a writer, that my life wasn't interesting enough. But looking at Emily, her eyes wide with possibility, her fingers tracing the edges of those stained cards, I felt something shift. Maybe it wasn't about my story. Maybe it was about ours. We called it The Table Between Us. At first, it was just an idea, a simple collection of recipes and short memories meant to be printed on the church copier and shared at potlucks. But word spread fast. People from the congregation started bringing in their own recipe cards, family photos, little blurbs about a dish their grandmother used to make every Sunday without fail. One man brought a recipe for his late wife's apple butter, along with a poem he'd written for her 50 years ago. Emily cataloged everything. She scanned the cards, typed up the stories, even added little illustrations, whisks, rolling pins, a pot of stew with hearts floating out of it. I wrote the introductions, short reflections about food and love, about forgiveness and memory. I kept my sentences plain, honest. We worked on it every weekend for 3 months, and with the help of a local print shop, who insisted on donating half the cost, we printed our first run of 100 copies. They sold out in a week. Soon after, we held a little book launch in the church fellowship hall. Nothing fancy, just pie and lemonade, a few folding chairs, and a stack of books on a gingham tablecloth. But the room was full of laughter, of hugs, of people flipping through pages like they were holding pieces of home. Emily stood beside me, cheeks flushed with pride. Reverend Keene gave a short blessing. Hazel made 3 dozen deviled eggs. And I just looked around and breathed. This wasn't a bestseller. This wasn't national news. But it was ours. A book made from memory, bound with care, filled with the kind of recipes you couldn't find online because they weren't just about food. They were about belonging. A week later, we got a letter in the mail. It was from a teacher at a high school in Charlotte. She'd somehow gotten a copy of the book and wanted to know if Emily and I would be willing to speak to her students about intergenerational storytelling. Emily squealed when she read it. "Grandma, we're official." I laughed. "I suppose we are, but more than that, I felt something settle in my chest. A kind of peace I hadn't known I was missing." We visited the school 2 weeks later. Emily stood at the front of a classroom filled with teenagers and told them about the cornbread recipe with just enough love to hold it together. I watched them smile, some laughing, some looking quietly thoughtful. Then I stepped forward. I used to think that once you lost your place in a family or in the world, there was no getting it back, I said. But sometimes you don't need to go back. You just need to build a new table. A girl in the front row raised her hand. "What do you do?" she asked. "If your family doesn't want to sit at your table." I paused. "You keep it open anyway," I said. "You leave a plate. You never know who might come." That night, Emily and I drove home under a purple sky. She leaned her head on the window, humming quietly, the kind of tune that lives somewhere between joy and nostalgia. I reached over and squeezed her hand. "You've made me proud," I said. She smiled without turning. "You made me possible," she whispered. And with that, the road ahead seemed wide and golden, like something worth walking together. The day we got our first invitation from out of state, I was icing a lemon pound cake. Emily burst through the church doors, waving an envelope like it was a golden ticket. "Grandma, it's from Tennessee." I raised an eyebrow. I didn't know Tennessee had mail. She rolled her eyes and shoved the letter into my hands. It was from a community center in Chattanooga. Someone had gifted them a copy of The Table Between Us, and now they wanted to host a weekend event around it, interviews, cooking demos, a talk about storytelling across generations. "They want us," Emily beamed. "Both of us." I stared at the letter. Me, a 72-year-old woman who once slept in a stable. Her, a 13-year-old with a heart big enough to carry a town. "They're paying for travel," she added, "and they're giving us a suite with a view of the river." I had to laugh. Not at her enthusiasm, but at the strange, beautiful truth of it all. Somewhere along the way, we'd gone from surviving to sharing, and people were listening. Over the next few months, the invitations kept coming. A small college in Virginia, a church in Alabama, a retirement community in Kentucky. Each place was different, but the response was always the same people hungry, not just for recipes, but for connection. At every stop, I'd bring my binder now stuffed to the brim with photos, notes, even a few napkins scribbled with memories. Emily brought her sketch pad, always adding new little drawings to match each story. Once, in a crowded church hall in Montgomery, an elderly man came up to me after I spoke. "You told the story of my mother," he said, voice thick with emotion. "She used to make biscuits on Sundays, just like you said." I hadn't thought about that in decades. I touched his arm gently. "Sometimes, memory needs an invitation." He nodded. "And sometimes it needs a recipe card." Back home in Hendersonville, things had shifted too. Supper and stories had grown. We now had teams of volunteers, a rotating menu, and even a legacy table where guests could bring a dish that meant something to their family. Every Thursday night, the fellowship hall filled with voices, not just eating, but remembering. One evening, Reverend Keene pulled me aside as we were packing up. "You ever think about what comes next?" he asked gently. I smiled. "For supper or for me?" He laughed. "Both." I wiped my hands on a towel. I used to think the end of life meant slowing down, shrinking, fading into the background. And now? Now I think, maybe the last part of life is actually the brightest, when you're no longer trying to prove anything and just start giving it all away. He looked at me for a moment, then said, "That sounds like a sermon." I shook my head. "That sounds like a truth. You only learn the long way." One Sunday afternoon, I sat in the quiet sanctuary after everyone had gone. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass, casting soft colors across the pews. My hands rested in my lap, fingers curled around a folded piece of paper, Emily's latest letter, even though she lived just 5 blocks away. She still wrote me, even now. It had become a habit between us, a rhythm, a way to say things we didn't always say aloud. In this letter, she wrote, "I used to think grown-ups had everything figured out, but now I think maybe the bravest thing is admitting when you don't and still showing up with love anyway." I closed my eyes, holding those words like a prayer, because she was right. None of this had been planned. Not the pain, not the healing, not the unexpected new life that had bloomed out of both. But I had shown up with hands that still shook sometimes, with a heart that had been bruised and bandaged, and I'd offered what I had. A story, a bowl of stew, a place at the table. That night, Emily came over for dinner. We cooked together in the church kitchen her biscuits, finally holding their shape, my stew needing less salt these days. We laughed, spilled flour, told the same stories we always did. As we sat down to eat, she looked up and asked, "Grandma, do you ever miss the past?" I thought for a moment. "I miss the people," I said. "And sometimes I miss how simple things used to feel." She nodded. "But you wouldn't go back?" I shook my head. "No, because then I wouldn't be here with you." She smiled. "Good, because I like you better now." I laughed. "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." It started with a fall. Nothing dramatic, just a slip in the church kitchen while reaching for the top shelf of the pantry. One second I was reaching for a jar of cinnamon. The next I was on the floor, staring up at the ceiling like it held answers. Emily wasn't there that day. Hazel was the one who found me, 10 minutes later, holding onto the counter and muttering about bruised pride. She rushed me to the urgent care, fussing the whole way. They ran tests, took x-rays, gave me ice packs and a gentle warning. "You're not as steady on your feet as you used to be," the doctor said kindly. "You might want to consider using a cane, maybe even a walker on tougher days." I nodded, holding the ice pack against my hip. But inside, I felt something loosen, something I hadn't wanted to name. That night, alone in my room, I stood in front of the mirror and looked at myself without blinking. The lines on my face had deepened. My hair was all silver now, not a single thread of brown left. My hands, once so strong and sure, had begun to tremble when still for too long. I wasn't sad, but I was aware that no matter how much warmth surrounded me, how full the kitchen got on Thursdays, how many letters Emily wrote, how much purpose I poured into my days, this body had limits. This life had a clock, and I didn't want to wait until the ticking got too loud. The next day, I made a list, not a bucket list. I didn't need to jump out of planes or visit Rome. I'd seen all the beauty I needed in a bowl of soup, in my granddaughter's smile, in the quiet forgiveness of old hymns. This was a different kind of list, a what to leave behind list. First, I wrote, my binder. All those stories, recipes, napkin scribbles. I'd add instructions for Emily to keep it growing, to pass it on, to never stop collecting what mattered. Then I wrote, a letter to Emily, one she wouldn't read until I was gone. I'd tell her how proud I was, how deeply I loved her, how her kindness had rewritten the ending of my life. I added, my recipes, but I would rewrite them not just measurements and steps, but context, a memory for each one, a name, a season, a story, so she'd know not just how to cook them, but how they felt in a house full of laughter or silence. And finally, a request, that they keep the Thursday suppers going, not in my name, not as a tribute, but simply because they matter, because someone will always need a place to sit. Over the next few weeks, I slowed down, not because I had to, but because I wanted to savor things. I let Emily do more of the stirring. I let Hazel boss me around. I stopped pretending I could climb ladders and accepted help without flinching. And I started saying thank you more deliberately. To the woman who brought me fresh flowers from her garden. To the teenager who wiped down tables without being asked. To the Lord, each morning, for the breath in my lungs and the ache in my bones. Because both meant I was still here. One evening, as we sat watching the sunset from the church steps, Emily turned to me and said, "You're planning something." I laughed. "Am I that obvious?" She shrugged. "You've been quieter, softer." I took a deep breath. "I'm just..." Thinking ahead, she looked worried. "You're not sick, are you?" "No, baby, just older." She was quiet a moment. Then she said, "You know, you don't have to leave everything behind. Some of it you get to take with you." I looked at her. She tapped her chest. "Like what you put in me." That was when I knew I'd done enough. Not everything, but enough. The next Sunday, I asked Reverend Keene if I could speak during service. He looked surprised, but nodded. And so, with a simple note card in my hand, I stood at the pulpit and looked out at the faces that had become my family. "I'm not going anywhere today," I began. "But one day I will. And before I do, I just want to say this. I used to believe that love was what we gave to others. That it was about sacrifice and service, and it island. But it's also about receiving. Letting people love you. Letting grace find you, even when you think you've outrun it. You all taught me that. A pause. I'm not afraid of what comes next. Because what came before right here, with you, was more than enough." The room was silent. Then Hazel stood. And one by one, they followed. Not applause. Just presence. A standing thank you. A kiatamen. That night, I started writing Emily's letter. The one she'd read one day far from now, I hoped. And at the top, before anything else, I wrote, "If you're reading this, no, I didn't leave empty." I hadn't been back to Asheville in over 10 years. Not since the day Samantha packed my suitcases and drove me to Hendersonville, smiling tight-lipped as she told me it was, "Just until you get your strength back, Mom." Of course, we both knew it was more permanent than that. But Asheville had never stopped being a part of me. It was where I built my life after Joe passed, where I raised my daughter, where I worked that little diner off Patton Avenue for 30 years and knew every customer's name before they said a word. And it was where Clara lived. Clara was once my best friend. Before Hazel. Before Hendersonville. Before everything fell apart over something as stupid as a loan I couldn't repay on time. We hadn't spoken in almost 15 years. She'd called me prideful. I'd called her controlling. Neither of us was completely wrong. But when I fell ill, when Samantha moved me away, when the world closed in Clara was one of the ghosts I couldn't shake. And now, with my body slowing down and my soul reaching for peace, I knew there was one last door I needed to knock on. Even if it never opened, Hazel insisted on driving. She packed sandwiches, tea in a thermos, and even brought a blanket, just in case we get philosophical at a park bench. That woman never did anything halfway. The drive took just under an hour, winding through familiar roads that made my chest tighten with memory. The dogwood trees were blooming early that year, soft pink against a clear blue sky. Clara still lived in the same bungalow on the east side, near the old library. I recognized the wind chime on her porch before I saw the house number. Hazel parked across the street. I sat in the passenger seat, staring. "Want me to wait?" she asked. "No," I said, adjusting my cardigan. "I need to do this alone." She didn't argue, just handed me the thermos and said, "In case it gets cold in there." I walked up the path slowly, the sound of gravel underfoot oddly comforting. The porch was just as I remembered: 2 rocking chairs, a faded welcome mat, a potted plant that was either dead or very dramatic. I knocked. Once, then again, and finally, the door opened. Clara looked older, of course, thinner. Her white hair was pulled back in a loose bun, and she wore a soft pink cardigan I swear I'd seen before. Maybe we'd bought them together once, on one of our let's pretend we have money shopping days. She stared at me for a long second. Then she said, "Well, I guess hell froze over. I laughed. Only slightly. She stepped aside. Come in before my neighbors start thinking I've joined a cult. The house smelled like lemon and dust and something baking. Her living room hadn't changed. Same floral couch, same crooked lampshade, same photograph of her late husband on the mantel. I sat on the edge of the couch, not wanting to assume anything. I didn't come to stir things up, I said. I just wanted to say hello and goodbye. Maybe. She raised an eyebrow. You dying? Eventually. She didn't smile, but she sat down, and for a long moment, we just breathed in the same space. I was hurt, she said finally. Back then. I know. You disappeared. I didn't know how to ask for help. You never did. That one stung, but it was true. And you, I said gently. You tried to fix everything. Even things I didn't ask to be fixed. She looked down at her hands. I didn't know how else to love people. I swallowed hard. We were both doing our best. It just didn't match. She nodded. So why now? Because I don't want to carry old grief into the next life. She looked at me, really looked, like someone wiping a foggy window after a long winter. Did you find peace? She asked. I did. And love? Yes. She exhaled. Then I guess we both did okay. We sat in silence for a while longer, the kind that feels like rest rather than discomfort. Then she stood up. You want some cobbler? It's peach, still warm. I smiled. I'd love that. We sat at her kitchen table, two old women with stubborn hearts, passing spoons and memories. She didn't ask me to stay. I didn't expect her to. But when I got up to leave, she walked me to the door and placed something in my hand. It was a recipe card. Her peach cobbler. Give it to that granddaughter of yours, she said. Tell her I said add extra cinnamon. I nodded, too full to speak. She didn't hug me, but she touched my shoulder, and that was more than enough. Back in the car, Hazel didn't say a word. She just handed me a cookie and drove us home under a quiet sky. And I leaned my head back, closed my eyes, and whispered into the soft hum of the road. Thank you. I knew it would be my last supper and stories. Not because something terrible had happened. Not because I was on death's door or had received any grim diagnosis. I was still walking slower, sure but still steady. My heart still beat strong, and my mind was clear enough to finish crosswords without cheating. Number. It was time simply because I felt it. Somewhere deep in my bones, in that quiet part of me that always knew when to rise before the sun or when a pot of stew needed more time, I knew the season was changing. It was time to step back, to pass the spoon, to make space for the next hands. We started planning 2 weeks in advance. Hazel rallied the volunteers. Reverend Keene offered the entire church building hall, sanctuary, garden, even his parking spot. Emily made invitations by hand, each one decorated with tiny drawings of rolling pins and steaming bowls. The word spread fast. People from neighboring towns RSVP'd. Retirees who'd attended just once years ago wrote to say they'd be there, no matter the weather. Even a small news station called asking if they could film it, and I politely declined. This isn't a spectacle, I told them. It's a supper. And it was. But it was also something else. It was a goodbye wrapped in gratitude. A final page turned with care. The morning of the event, I woke early. Emily was already in the kitchen, hair tied back, apron on, flour smudged across her cheek. Morning, chef, I teased. She turned, grinning. I made the biscuit dough from scratch. No cheating. I tasted it. Needs more salt. She groaned. You always say that. Because you never believed me the first time. We laughed. And I let that moment stretch long in my heart, like rising bread. By 5 o'clock, the church hall was full. Tables lined with tablecloths and wildflowers. The walls were decorated with framed recipe cards and photos from past events. In the corner, a small easel held the first copy of the table between us, open to the peach cobbler page. That was Clara's recipe. I smiled at it like an old friend. When it was time to speak, I stood at the front of the hall with Emily beside me. I didn't need notes. I didn't need anything but my voice and my truth. "Thank you all," I began, "for showing up, for listening, for letting me feed you, and more importantly, for feeding me in return." A soft laugh rippled through the room. "I came here 5 years ago with nothing but a broken body and a bruised spirit. I didn't expect to stay. I didn't expect to live again. But you gave me that, each of you. I paused, steadying my voice. "This will be my last supper. Not because I'm leaving this world, but because I believe in stepping aside with grace. Because the table doesn't belong to me. It belongs to all of us. And it's time for new voices, new hands, new stories." Emily squeezed my hand. I looked down at her. "This young lady here, my granddaughter, my miracle, will be taking over supper and stories moving forward. With help, of course. She's already better at biscuits than I ever was." End of chapter. She rolled her eyes and mouthed, "Still needs more salt." The crowd chuckled. "And I'll still be around," I continued. "Sitting at the back, sneaking extra dessert, nodding along, but I want this next chapter to come from you, from the community, because that's where it always lived." I took a deep breath. "So tonight, instead of telling a story, I want to listen. I want to hear yours." And they came, one by one. A man who said he hadn't spoken in public in 20 years shared a poem he wrote for his late wife. A teenage girl stood and said, "This supper is the only place I've ever seen my dad smile." A woman in a wheelchair rolled forward and recited a recipe for molasses cookies so vividly, you could taste the brown sugar in her voice. And I listened. I soaked it in like warm broth on a winter day, the sound of stories rising like steam. Later that night, long after the dishes were washed and the lights dimmed, I walked through the empty hall alone. I touched the backs of chairs, traced the folds in the tablecloths, whispered thank yous to the ghost of every meal shared in this room. Then I walked into the kitchen and turned off the stove. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of laughter, tears, prayers, and recipes, full of all the lives that had passed through and left pieces of themselves behind. I placed my apron on the hook by the door, and I walked out into the soft night air, into the cricket's song, into whatever came next. Emily caught up to me outside. She didn't say anything, just took my hand, and in the hush of that holy moment, under the watchful moon and the scent of leftover cornbread in the air, we stood together, not as the beginning or the end, but as part of something everlasting. I'm writing this with a cup of tea by my side and Emily's newest letter resting on my lap. She's 15 now. Her handwriting is taller, her thoughts deeper. She writes about books and dreams and boys she won't name yet. But she always ends with the same words. "There's always a seat at my table for you, Grandma." I smile every time I read it, because that's all I ever wanted, for the table to stay open. Some days, I move slower than others. My knees complain when it rains, and my hands no longer trust me with the sharpest knives. But I still bake. I still tell stories. I still sit with strangers who become friends over soup and silence. And I still listen. I listen more than I speak now. I've found that most people aren't looking for answers, they just want someone to stay when the words get heavy. So I stay. I don't know when my time will come, but I'm not afraid anymore. Not of leaving, and not of being forgotten. Because I've come to understand something. You don't have to do something loud to matter. You don't have to be famous, or perfect, or whole. You just have to love well, and keep your table open. To whoever is holding this story in your hands, or hearing it read to you, I want to say this. You are not too old to begin again. You are not too broken to be useful. You are not too late to be loved. And you are never, ever too far gone to come back to the table. So if you've been wandering, if you've been aching, if you've been waiting for a sign, let this be it. Come home. Pull up a chair. There's stew on the stove and bread in the oven and light in the kitchen. We've been saving you a seat. Always. With love, Lorraine Delaney. What did you feel while listening to this story all the way through? If it touched your heart, leave the #1 the comments. If you didn't feel connected to it, feel free to write 0. Every piece of feedback means a lot to me, because it's thanks to you that I can keep going. It's from your responses that I draw the energy to tell the next chapter a new story is coming, even deeper, even more moving. And I truly hope you'll be there to listen with me.